A while ago, a peculiar thought occurred to me whilst I was driving in the heat. When cars sit in the sun, the leather elements of the car get searingly hot to the point where they hurt to touch, and my steering wheel is mostly leather. Bit problematic. However, thankfully, most of it was out of the direct sunlight, so I could use it, but the top section was still painful to the touch, and when making certain manoeuvres that required the wheel to oversteer, I got reminded of that fact. Which got me thinking about calling the top of the steering wheel the top. Why do we do that? It's a wheel. All of it occasionally becomes the top when we drive. It's inevitable. Hell, the only reason I got reminded the top was hot was because it temporarily stopped being the top. And sure, we call it the top because of how it sits in a neutral position, but that just took me deeper. Despite other parts of the wheel sometimes occupying the principal condition of topness, we label that bit top because of the circumstances in which it exists. Because it's understood as being in a car and in that car as having a neutral position, this part of the wheel gets to be the top when other wheels don't get a top. Now, I also had another thought after. Why the f*** does it matter? It's a steering wheel at the end of the day, it's attached to a vehicle, and it makes the other wheels pivot so you don't crash into the first obstacle you meet. You'd be right to ridicule me for spending this much of a video essay talking about it, but put a pin in these thoughts. Not the wheel bit necessarily, just keep in mind that sometimes a thing gets understood in a certain way because of the circumstances around it. Oftentimes man-made circumstances, and because we're mankind, that means if we wanted to, we could rethink them. Anyway, enough of that. Let's talk about transphobes and their incessant pearl-clutching about biology. So, let's get a few things out of the way. If you didn't already know, I am a trans woman. Hi. If you're looking for a balanced perspective on issues like trans people and biology today, you're out of luck. There is no such thing as a balanced view on this debate when the stakes are so horrendously skewed against people like me. Changing your mind is not comparable to mandated non-existence, so you're getting solely my takes today. It's our human rights as trans people on the line, not anyone else's, so frankly, f*** balance. Balance, wankers! If you're coming into this video agreeing with public transphobes about biology, I have two things to say to you. First, like, comment, subscribe. Second, if you're simply here to trade ideological blows, as it were, I'd advise you drop your dislike now and stop wasting your time. Your bad faith comments will be deleted, and it's not because I disagree with you, it's because the logical conclusion of the worldview you're peddling brings a lot of unnecessary harm, and I'm not dealing with it this time. But if you'd like to see what dealing with those kinds of comments looks like, check out patreon.com/themetalgoddess. However, if you're here in good faith, welcome. I hope you enjoy the show and learn some interesting stuff. So, the video title. Whatever it is right now. Something to do with trans people and biology and why the two of those aren't necessarily antonyms. Why am I talking about this? Well, to be honest, it's because biology is frequently cited by anti-trans actors as a reason to deny us equal rights. You know, the myriad permutations of sex is a binary, and you are what your biology is, and that's it. And why should a biological male be allowed in female spaces? And listen, I know these arguments get made in bad faith. They always do. The principal goal of using biology arguments, and even groomer and delusional arguments, is to other trans people, with the added bonus of distracting everyone from actual systemic issues like climate change, wealth inequality, and faux democracy in the interest of those who platform and fund anti-trans actors. Don't worry, it's not lost on me that when I'm done today, there is zero chance the anti-trans network packs up and goes home. The thing is, though, The usual counter to the biology argument is to argue past it, to say biology doesn't matter in pretty much every context. And there is merit to that, believe me. Like, I've used it, it's very true. The problem is that using this argument kinda tacitly concedes that the transphobes are right about biology, we just don't care. And how do I put this? They're just not. And I think allowing them this win grants them undeserved legitimacy and creates unnecessary roadblocks in the way of trans rights. So today, we're going to attack the biology arguments directly. We're going to take a look at the intricacies of biology, do a deep dive on what sex is, spoilers by the way, they're not the same thing, and show, I hope, that anyone who cites an anti-trans biology argument is not only wrong, but definitively does not care, which is a shame. Like, honestly, I think the worst thing about people like Matt Walsh and Kelly J. Keane who peddle this closed-off, almost dogmatically anti-trans worldview, aside from the human rights issues at the logical end of this transphobic rainbow, is how resistant they seem to be to learning really cool stuff about our bodies. Honestly, the transphobes, this is awesome. Like, I'm pumped, let's fucking talk about it. I got a great place to start too. An educational video? Fun? Looks pretty old. Nah, let me go find a way to put this on digital.
Why, good day to you, young ragamuffins. I bet you're wondering what's happening to that body of yours and why things are changing and making you feel sad. Well, wonder no further, because it's time to learn about sex and what makes you different from that pretty young thing sitting next to you. It all goes back to the beginning, when our Lord and Saviour created mankind in his image.
Boring.
And when their wish comes true, they're presented with either a girl or a boy. That's you! If you're a girl, your special region looks like a little slot we call the tuppence. And if you're a boy, it'll be a tiny little sausage we call the todger. As you get older, you boys may find yourselves growing stronger, your hair short and your skin tough. And you girls will find yourselves being kind, with long hair and dainty, delicate skin. And now you're here, you'll start to notice some other things too. The boys will get very tall, growing hair all over their bodies and their voices becoming rugged and earthy. And the girls will notice their chests and hips begin to grow, with a certain tuppence beginning to show you in its own special way that you're ready to start wishing for little boys and girls of your own. And you both may start to think some sinful things about each other, so we need to have a little chat about...
That's enough of that. So, I'm guessing that sounds kinda familiar. Like, wherever you are in your knowledge of biology, you've heard stuff like that before, right? That there are two sexes and that they have specific characteristics like different genitalia, different secondary characteristics like breasts, deepened voices and body hair, different chromosomes, and so on. Now, let's get one thing clear before we start. I don't want to say that understanding is wrong, necessarily. Personally, I think it is, but it's more productive for us to label it incomplete. As a way of viewing human biology, this understanding is probably mostly correct. As Julia Serano acknowledges in Whipping Girl via her intrinsic inclination model, most people will experience congruence with it, being typically male or female. However, there are a fair few pitfalls with this understanding. And for starters, the way we typically discuss human biology is incredibly oversimplified. Characterizing it as a binary choice, we'll get to that, makes it seem as simple as flipping a switch in the womb, where every biological facet clicks to the whims of one process. But as any biologist will tell you, it is not that simple. Judith Butler, trans YouTuber quoting Butler cliche, alludes to this in Gender Trouble.
And what is sex, anyway? Is it natural, anatomical, chromosomal, or hormonal?
Because, yeah, there are several factors we could use to ascribe meaning to our biology. And as Butler suggests, there are our genitals, our chromosomes, our hormone concentration, and that's just Butler. If we look to a biologist's opinion, such as Joanna Harper in Sporting Gender, we get an even further nuanced division of biological markers.
There are different ways one can subdivide biological sex into its component pieces. I prefer to use 7 categories: gonads, external genitalia, internal genitalia, chromosomes, hormones, secondary sex characteristics, and gender identity. Others would use different divisions, and some experts would argue gender identity is not biologically based, but no expert would claim biological sex is simple.
Now you might be thinking, okay, biology's not just one system. So? Those systems still shoot towards the same goal, right? Which leads us on to our next problem that arises from typical perceptions of biology, the error of holistic consequentiality, which is an existing phrase, I think, but I'm pretty sure I'm the only one currently using it for this specific purpose, so feel free to cite me if you're doing a biology or gender studies degree. It sounds like alphabet salad, but it's quite simple. Holistic consequentiality here refers to when we look at an individual's characteristics, let's say they have a beard, and immediately presume all the other qualities we associate with them. In this case, we might presume possession of a penis or XY chromosomes. But if we're talking raw biology, this is a mistake, because the biological systems we've been discussing so far do not necessarily function in tandem with one another. Jackson Wagon explains this very well in his video debunking Matt Walsh's biology claims. We can see through observations of intersex biological constructions that one factor doesn't necessarily imply another for myriad reasons. And it's not just in intersex people either. I once knew a cis bloke with a voice so high-pitched he'd get misgendered over the phone all the time. Women with PCOS can exhibit atypical body hair growth, so yeah, biological factors are not necessarily causal in the way a typical understanding suggests. And, well, we've opened the intersex door now, haven't we? So let's talk about the other pitfall typical views of biology run into. As promised, the binary. Very simple point to make here, our biology isn't that. A binary view takes such dichotomies as XXXY, male-female, penis-vagina as given, but that's incorrect. Developmentally, we're not machines. We're comprised of many different chemical processes, and nature doesn't always put us together in ways that corroborate a binary. With the greatest respect, it ain't that good. A way to visualize this is by pouring glasses of water. Now, I don't care how good your pouring skills are, you can't pour a perfect half glass of water consistently. Even if these look the same, which they probably don't, the amount of water in each one will be different. So if you imagine the glasses as our biological factors and the water as the hormones that stimulate them, you can see why biologists concur that this produces more of a spectrum than a binary. Chemical processes just ain't that consistent. Now imagine I get distracted and overpour one of the glasses. Imagine I run out of water, or I'm given more glasses than I was expecting. These aren't perfect analogies, of course, but we can imagine similarly atypical circumstances that produce intersex constructions, like in individuals with congenital adrenal hyperplasia, where excessive adrenal gland growth causes those with XX karyotypes to exhibit ambiguous genitalia, or people with Klinefelter syndrome, whose atypical XX or even XXY karyotypes can result in non-congruent secondary sex characteristics. What this is all pointing to, of course, is that the typical anti-trans biology arguments simply don't work. The usual line of attack revolves around insisting that biology is binary and that it perfectly indicates the side of that binary a person should be, dictating how they should act, appear, and be treated by wider society. It's very essentialist, with the implication being that perceptions of trans people should be based on a presumed biological construction instead of what's socially correct. Matt Walsh uses this framing all the time.
And how doesn't a transgender woman fit that definition?
Female. Because they're not female. They have, you said that you are a biological male, correct?
Going back to Jackson Wagon's video, we can demonstrate that this line of thinking doesn't, nay, can't work for everyone. During that debate, the trans woman points out that she could be intersex, and Walsh just kind of sidelines that point, either because he didn't get it or because he did and sees the problem. That, as Jackson shows us, despite Walsh's attempts to suggest that all intersex people can be categorised as male or female, no, they can't, which derails the entire premise of denying trans people recognition of our genders on the basis of our biology. The attempt to stick us on whichever side of the binary our presumed biological constructions suggest falls flat if we end up being constructed in a way that could be both sides or neither. As Mia Mulder points out in her video on the trans debate, you don't know. This trans woman could be intersex, not a biological male. And what do you do with her then, Matt? Which bathroom should she use? And that's not even considering the obvious objection, of course, that this argument rests upon the idea that our biology is binary, when it's not. The fact that intersex people exist at all proves this, but hey, Matt, don't let that deter you.
Well, but that's a different conversation. Intersex, that's a genetic anomaly, that's a medical condition. So that's a completely different conversation. That's also that's not a third gender. That's a genetic anomaly that occurs within the sex binary of male and female. I
fucking love that pause afterwards. It's like you can see in real time his brain go, oh, hang on, that doesn't make sense. Like, I don't want to get all pedantic over language, even though transphobes do that all the fucking time, but if anomalies can occur within the binary, it's not a true binary anymore, is it? Not like, for example, computer code, literally called binary, where all information is represented by zeros or ones, no twos, no eights, just a gajillion on-off switches. Like, the fact we get anomalies in our biology proves it's not a binary. People like Walsh like to portray biology as this simple, definitive, immutable process where you're either one thing or the other and that's that. But they're wrong. In reality, it's complex and multifaceted. The science says so. Even the supposed alienation from our biology trans people supposedly exhibit isn't accurate. For example, if I used Harper's biological subdivisions, sure, my gonads, genitalia, and maybe my chromosomes are male, but hormonally, I'm female. And my secondary characteristics are ambiguous. I still have stubble, but I also have breasts. But we know what Walsh's feelings are towards biologists and their pesky nuance, because he tells us in that debate.
You guys like to bring up high school level biology classes a lot. I get that a lot. But people who go on to more complicated biology classes will talk about sex as a spectrum.
It's not. It's not.
Well, biological researchers would disagree with you.
Well, then they're full of the ones that would say that.
Side note, when did the anti-SJW community, with atheist community roots, go from predominantly leveraging science to dunk on creationists to fucking with a guy who openly tells scientists with peer-reviewed and tested knowledge of cross-consensus they're full of shit because he doesn't like their conclusion? Like, when did the facts over feelings community's bar for belief get so low? What we're seeing here is just how closed off Walsh and people like him are. They're not interested in potentially rethinking how we see the world, even though that is literally what science is, endlessly redefinable in light of new discoveries. They want what they already think to be the answer. Simple, unchanging. It's almost theistic. Like, I was kidding before, but we have come full circle, haven't we? This very logic is what the anti-SJW crowd used to cheer on being destroyed. I know this because I was there. I was part of it. And seeing our biology as this fixed monolith of supposed societal importance blinds you to just how exciting and complex our bodies are. Like, how we're built has never been simple or fixed. While I was reading up on trans biology for this video, I ended up learning really cool stuff, like how female pelvic structures have evolved to compromise between optimal childbearing and walking, and how they literally change shape throughout a woman's life cycle in response to post-pubertal and premenopausal hormone exposure. And there are studies demonstrating that certain what are known as sexually dimorphic bone structures literally change with the use of exogenous hormones. Like, we are so weird and malleable as human beings, and I don't know, am I the only one who thinks that's so fucking cool? I could be wrong here, but it seems, from what I've read, that if a trans girl gets to go through the puberty she wants with the use of hormone replacement therapy, things like her hips and her voice could reflect her gender magnitudes better than, my situation, for example. And genuinely, when you look at the research into womb transplants for trans women, we could have a scenario in the future where a trans woman who went through the right puberty is giving live birth. Not by C-section, but the old-fashioned way. How f***ing cool is that? By the way, I'd just like to point out that I don't bring this up to suggest one birthing method is better than the other. It's just that live births were previously unthinkable for trans women compared to C-sections. Both methods are very valid and very beautiful and potentially traumatic. One isn't necessarily better than the other. I can't begin to imagine the euphoria that first trans woman who pulls that off would get to feel, how happy she would be. Because that's what this comes down to, for me. When I look at the worldview of people like Matt Walsh and Kelly J. Keane and friends and compare it to my own, I realise that our motivations differ at the root. Insisting biology is fixed and binary and decisive and socially integral seems to be motivated by order and control in the service of, privilege, higher power, whereas I see biology for what it is and lean into it because its weirdness and malleability could be manipulated to serve us. We can make people's dreams come true, things they never thought possible. And obviously anything demonstrably unhealthy or destructive isn't worth pursuing, but none of what I've mentioned here, as far as I've read anyway, definitively damages people. It just allows them to become who they are, to be happy. I put it to anyone watching, if we aren't chasing happiness with all of our advancements and technologies, if the outcomes aren't serving us in the best possible way, why are we doing it? Being happy, making the best of this one life we get, is everything, isn't it? Okay, poeticizing aside, let's say you're not convinced, because believe me, as I'm writing this, I do see certain bits you could pick holes in if you wanted to. It's okay, I will address them. If you're really clever, you may have noticed that I picked my language very carefully. Unless it was in a book or a video I've cited, I've refrained from using the word sex in this section. And that is for a very good reason we'll explore next. Sex and biology are not, as I teased earlier, strictly speaking, the same thing.
A woman by her nature can get pregnant. A man by his nature never can. So if you meet a woman of childbearing age, say she's 28 years old, and she can't get pregnant, you know automatically that something has gone wrong. And she can go to the doctor and find out what that thing is, even if they can't fix it. So that proves that women by their nature can get pregnant, because the simple fact that she can't shows you that there's something wrong. This is what is known as the exception that proves the rule. Whereas if a male with a penis can't get pregnant, no doctor on earth is going to run tests to see what's wrong with him, because they already know it's that he's a male, and there's only male and female, those who can get pregnant and those who can't.
This video's got way too much Matt Walsh in it. So, okay. Some of you, including but not limited to Matt Walsh and people agreeing with him, probably heard me talking about intersex people, anecdotes of male variants and women with PCOS, and said something similar to Walsh's points, like his earlier claim of anomalies not disproving a general trend, or just now his allusion to disease not being the same as a variation we could attribute to biology being on a spectrum. Walsh does a lot of dishonesty with how he presents these arguments. I mean, he's conflating different topics, he's oversimplifying biological division down to a singular characteristic, but it's the essence of what he's doing here that's important, because this is something they all do. The transphobic ace in the hole. And to explain it, we're going to ditch Matt Walsh for a bit because he's low-hanging fruit and I need evidence to tar all transphobes with this brush. So to do that, unfortunately, we have to talk about Kathleen's stock again. After discussing Kathleen's nonsense for way too long last time, I genuinely didn't think I'd need to again, and so I threw out her book, but it's okay. If there's one place in the world you can guarantee you'll find some bullshit, it's the countryside, and aha! Here we are. Big steaming pile, as expected. Ignore the tabs, it's definitely not my copy I just put over there for the bit. Being an unrepentant transphobe, Kathleen does her own brand of debunking claims that biology is a complicated spectrum and therefore not a useful allegory for binary social categorization.
Disease and variation can interfere, as can environmental influences and old age. Yet we do not normally say organisms subject to such interference are no longer female or male. When we talk about females and males, we are talking about a capacity that a given organism either actually has or at least would have had under certain given circumstances, e.g. had that particular variation not occurred, had that particular environmental factor not interfered, etc.
But aha! Did you see the trick? The discursive sleight of hand? We're not talking about biology anymore. Well, okay, maybe a little, but what we're actually talking about is philosophy. She says it out loud. She's not describing raw, foundational biology here. She's starting from a presumption she already has,
Given circumstances,
and working backwards from that to ascribe status to that biology. Matt Walsh does the same, implying a preconceived right expectation of biology when he says,
Something has gone wrong.
and that, my lovely viewers, is what sex really is. Okay, so we're about to go on a journey. There's a lot to cover, and the only reason I'm saying all this and breaking narrative flow is because I want to implore you to not just give up halfway through. I'm going to say shit that's probably going to sound wild if you haven't already been introduced to this kind of thinking, so just give me a chance, it'll be worth it. The prevailing understanding of sex in, I would say, most areas of society is that it's natural. And the anti-transosphere is no exception. Appealing to nature is one of the core tenets of their perceived legitimacy.
This does not obviate the biological duality of sex upon which all progeneration is based for all of human history and for all mammalian species.
But if I may deviate from talking about them for a moment, I got a bit of a bone to pick with the pro-trans and feminist spheres here, because our propagation of the sex-gender distinction, and I say our because I've literally done this in my previous videos, leans into this idea that sex is natural, which is problematic, first and foremost, for reasons brought up by Judith Butler.
Levi-Strauss's structuralist anthropology, including the problematic nature-culture distinction, has been appropriated by some feminist theorists to support and elucidate the sex-gender distinction, the position that there is a natural or biological female who is subsequently transformed into a socially subordinate woman, with the consequence that sex is to nature, or the raw, as gender is to culture, or the cooked. This very concept of sex as matter, sex as instrument of cultural signification, however, is a discursive formation that acts as a naturalized foundation for the nature-culture distinction and the strategies of domination that that distinction supports. The binary relation between culture and nature promotes a relationship of hierarchy in which culture freely imposes meaning on nature and, hence, renders it into an other to be appropriated to its own limitless uses.
Bunch of cloud just rolled over and totally killed the vibe. Put simply, since Butler's being a real Butler about it, when we create this distinction between sex and gender, to make the argument sex is socially irrelevant and gender is real, pliable and socially correct, we set up a binary between nature and culture and seemingly pick the side of culture, meaning anyone who wishes to oppose trans rights or feminism gets to side with and assign importance to nature. And if there was ever a discursive trump card to not just hand over, it's nature.
We don't belong here. It's just not natural.
Because we, as a society, love invoking and falling for nature as an immutable, inevitable, and desirable truth. It's ubiquitous in our food and hygiene advertising.
You want natural, effective beauty products.
It's in our music. It's on our messages of social justice and personal empowerment.
The problem is you assume this struggle is attached to a social class. I am black and bold and beautiful by nature. Ain't no income that can change that.
But it's also used as a justification for a lot of shitty stuff. like when Camille Paglia, don't read them, uses it for apologia. Contemporary American feminism, which began by rejecting Freud because of his alleged sexism, has shut itself off from his ideas of ambiguity, contradiction, conflict, ambivalence. Its simplistic psychology is illustrated by the new cliché of the date rape furor: no always means no. Will we ever graduate from the Girl Scouts? No has always been, and always will be, part of the dangerous, alluring courtship ritual of sex and seduction, observable even in the animal kingdom. Or when Matt Walsh, hello again Matt, uses it in his old tirade about marriage and, I guess, advocacy for widespread teenage pregnancy?
Fact 3. Girls between the ages of like 17 and 24 is when they're technically most fertile.
Yeah.
Okay? That's biological. That's a fact, all right? I'm just stating facts.
Just a quick note, though. In the research I mentioned before, the science seems to suggest that women reach optimal child-rearing age in their late 20s or early 30s, so no, Matt, as usual, you're not stating facts. And then, of course, there are the appeals to nature used to justify systems of domination and oppression, as highlighted by Catherine McKinnon with regards to sex.
Women are not, in fact, subordinated or oppressed by our bodies. We do not need to be liberated from our chromosomes or our ovaries. It is core male-dominant ideology that attributes the source of women's inequality to our nature, our biological sex, which for male dominance makes it inevitable, immutable, unchangeable, on us. As if our bodies, rather than male-dominant social systems, do it to us.
Parroted and upheld by people like Sam Harris with regards to race.
People don't want to hear that intelligence is a real thing, and that some people have more of it than others. They don't want to hear that IQ tests really measure it. They don't want to hear that differences in IQ matter, because they're highly predictive of differential success in life, and not just for things like educational attainment and wealth, but for things like out-of-wedlock birth and mortality. People don't want to hear that a person's intelligence is in large measure due to his or her genes, and that there seems to be very little we can do environmentally to increase a person's intelligence, even in childhood. It's not that the environment doesn't matter, but genes appear to be 50 to 80% of the story. People don't want to hear this. And they certainly don't want to hear that average IQ differs across races and ethnic groups.
And when the content of those systems comes under question, people like Jordan Peterson step back and appeal to nature to justify the very concept of an oppressive system.
Organisms that have to cooperate and compete with other organisms of their type inevitably arrange themselves into hierarchies, and that's been going on for so long, which is at least 300 million years, that our nervous systems have adapted to hierarchies as if they're a permanent element of being, right? More permanent than trees, like seriously permanent. The most fundamental neurochemical, the one that regulates the entire brain, serotonin, is acutely sensitive to hierarchical distinctions. And so that's part of the proposition. So the reason I laid that proposition forward was to say, whatever pitfalls hierarchies might produce, you cannot lay them at the feet of the West, patriarchy, or capitalism.
So, appeals to nature are everywhere. And sure, there are a lot of good things about nature. Natural foods are surely preferable to barely accountable chemical additives, and the countryside is surely better than crowded, polluted cities. But when we attack arguments grounded in appeals to nature, we usually go after how true the argument is, rather than stepping back and asking why these bad actors presume nature is good or immutable. Because it's neither of those things. Nature can be bad for us, and we can subvert it. I'm sure we'd agree that tornadoes, volcanic eruptions, and pandemics are bad for our health, and I'm sure we'd also agree that it's not inevitable we have to deal with them. We can move away or build defenses against them. When Peterson claims hierarchies are natural, even if that's true, which it's not, that's not a reason to never question them. If we're capable of understanding them, then we're also capable of subverting and quashing attempts to form them. And the sex-gender distinction not only fails to question the logical fallacy of appealing to nature to barricade your argument, it actively encourages it to be used, reinforcing its legitimacy and ultimately making it harder for groups resting on this distinction to gain public acceptance. And, of course, tacitly, as mentioned before, this distinction leans into the existing notion that sex is natural when it's not. In the sex-gender distinction, gender is understood as the cultural inscription of, stuff, values, meaning to sex. In other words, sex comes first, and then we, as a society, put a whole bunch of other things like hair and clothing styles, behaviour codes, and career expectations on top. But we didn't always separate sex and gender, yet gender norms were arguably even more prevalent before de Beauvoir. And that's because sex itself is also a cultural inscription of values and meaning, but to our biology instead. The principal difference between sex and biology is that biology is the biology, and sex is all the other stuff we do around it. Sex is the naming conventions we use, sex is the framework we use to understand how certain parts work and how we can be different to each other, and later on, sex is the cultural implications like gender norms and implicit bias. Basically, every time you think of someone or draw conclusions about them through a male or female lens, you are doing sex. Not the fun kind. If you're still not with me, try this out. I'm a trans woman, right? I was assigned male at birth, a label that helps others understand me. But that didn't come first, did it? My biology did, and only after I was born did someone else label me. Similarly to how we name anything, to be honest. Like, for example, we only call the planet Mars Mars because we named it that, but like as a hunk of rock in space, it would have existed either way. Likewise, our biology exists and does as it does, whether we try to name it and categorize it or not, and that's the difference. Biology is the thing, sex is how we understand and comprehend the thing. So it might be helpful from here to think of sex as a system, one that sorts people into categories of male and female, that predicts the likelihood of certain characteristics those people may have and certain diseases they might be prone to, whilst assigning social labels, all based on biological differences. It's still not wrong per se to say sex is about biology here, but we are now describing a culturally instigated system of classification that those of us still huffing that dank sex gender cush should acknowledge as such.
Can we refer to a given sex or a given gender without first inquiring into how sex and/or gender is given through what means? How is a feminist critic to assess the scientific discourses which purport to establish such facts for us? Are the ostensibly natural facts of sex discursively produced by various scientific discourses in the service of other political and social interests? If the immutable character of sex is contested, perhaps this construct called sex is as culturally constructed as gender. Indeed, perhaps it was always already gender, with the consequence that the distinction between sex and gender turns out to be no distinction at all.
Disagree with Butler's analysis if you like, but I do think it gels with how sex and gender tend to externally manifest, in that we are culturally assigned a sex and or gender, and both get used by outside forces to create and police boundaries of personal freedoms with regards to how we act, dress and express ourselves. I mean, sure, uniquely when sex is cited to justify those boundaries, the appeal to nature comes out, but the attempts to bypass that and split sex and gender often just get dismissed as bullshit anyway by those outside forces, so I don't know, I think Butler's got a point here. I know. So there is an elephant in the room that needs addressing. At this point, if you can see it, you see it. And I don't want to leave it alone because as an idea, it can be pretty controversial and often gets heavily misunderstood. Everything we've been discussing in this section so far has been circling one particular drain, a conclusion implied but as yet unstated, that sex is a social construct. I don't want to get too off topic and explain what social constructs are. There's already a perfectly good video about them on PhilosophyTube anyway, but I do want to lay some caveats. Firstly, in saying sex is a social construct, I am not saying that sex isn't real. It is real, but a different kind of real to, say, a tree you can see or a note you can hear. It's real because it's a concept we invented to help us make sense of the world. We made it real. I am also not saying that sex or any aspects of it you hold important don't matter. The whole point of identifying things as social constructs is to imply, since they're man-made, that we can change or rethink them. And that's not a bad thing. To call something a social construct isn't to drag it. They aren't innately evil. Sex, for example, I think, probably started out as a noble goal. You know, contextualizing our biology into two general trends and having a consensus on what's normal and healthy for those trends to treat and prevent specific diseases is, no shade, amazing. Saving lives is good, actually. But as you can probably tell by the length of the video, the waters get a little muddy around sex. Now, I won't go over the long, enduring legacy of sexism here because you get it. You know what that is. Hell, even if you don't think it's a thing, you know we do, right? Like, I don't have to explain it here, do I? It's not what I want to talk about, and actually, do you know what? I kinda already did. But honestly, please don't go watch it. It's some really early work, it's pretty terrible, and I genuinely think you have better ways of spending an hour. But also, general cultural problems aside, we've seen that sex can be a little incomplete, right? We've discussed why viewing biology as a holistically consequential binary definitely doesn't do to serve everyone, because the categories we invented to contextualize our biology are simply too rigid and binary. Left to its own devices, as we've seen, biology just doesn't work like that, not entirely anyway. Yet, despite us realizing this, we can be, culturally and medically, quite wedded to the old pitfalls of sex, as Julia Serano mentions.
Because the physical traits we take into account when describing sex are biological in origin, there is a tendency to see sex as being a natural aspect of gender. However, this is not quite the case. Cultural expectations and assumptions play a large role in shaping how we determine and consider sex. For example, in our culture, such assumptions are very genital-centric. A person's sex is assigned at birth based on the presence or absence of a penis. Thus, our genitals play a far more important role in determining our legal sex than do our chromosomes, or our reproductive capacity. Indeed, the fact we even have a legal sex demonstrates that society greatly shapes our understanding of sex.
Keep that last bit in mind, I'm sure it'll come up later. But what I really want to talk about is the thing I don't hear very often, about what I think is the most insidious and I'd say dangerous problem with sex, particularly in the medical profession, though don't get me wrong, there is a massive cultural aspect of it that's probably the biggest reason this problem persists. What I'm talking about is the moment the social construct starts to usurp its purpose as a descriptive tool and become prescriptive. And to explain what the hell I'm talking about, we'll go back to Kathleen. So before, when Kathleen wrote,
"Given circumstances,"
we can see now that she's appealing to the system of sex, that is, picking a start point, a presumption of what biology should look like, what we might call the platonic ideal of sex, and working backwards to ascribe a certain status to any given individual's biology. Now, we know that not everyone will conform to what our current system of sex defines as normal, or at least within a normal range, okay? That's scientifically true. So what do? Well, the usual solution, as we've already seen Matt Walsh do, is to other these people. We have a grand old tradition in our society of hierarchizing people's biological realities based on how much they adhere to presumed conventions of sexual development, in which that platonic ideal they're being compared to appeals to ideas of normal and healthy, to label non-conforming realities as diseases, anomalies, and aberrations. In other words, it's not the system that's wrong, it's you, anonymous intersex person, which is obviously unfair and bullshit and psychologically damaging too. One of the recurring themes of the 2017 Human Rights Watch study into how intersex people are treated by medical establishments is how alien they feel, how they're treated like freaks, despite the fact there's no evidence to suggest they're any less healthy or capable of living full, happy lives outside of very specific issues like salt wasting and congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which functionally is no more difficult to treat than conditions like diabetes, for example. So what we're seeing here is arrogance, a belief that we've cracked the case and that any evidence to the contrary can and should be compartmentalized within the current system of understanding. I've already made the comparison with closed-minded theistic denials of evidence, but I literally cannot tell the difference anymore between people like Kathleen clinging to a demonstrably outdated understanding of biology in the face of new evidence, and this 16-year-old Bill O'Reilly video the facts over feelings community used to laugh at.
Jesus was a real guy. I could see him. Yeah. You know, and I know what he did. And so I'm not positive that Jesus is God, but I'm throwing in with Jesus rather than throwing in with you guys, because you guys can't tell me how it all got here. You guys don't know.
We're working on it.
Just so it's clear though, f*** you Richard Dawkins, you transphobe. This issue transcends Kathleen, frankly, because the biggest problem this societal insistence on a model of holistically consequential binary sex creates is, instead of the system being redefined to include and serve everyone in the wake of new scientific discoveries, we end up working backwards to fit people into the system. And that's not a scientific decision. As I said earlier, it's philosophical, it's praxis. We could rethink sex, but that sounds hard. Can't we just call intersex people anomalies and go home? The consequences of deciding the latter are gut-wrenching, though. Deeming intersex people anomalies leads us into doing stupid f***ing things, from the social ostracism of sex non-conforming people, like in the case of intersex athlete Caster Semenya, to infamously performing surgery on f***ing children without their consent, often saddling them with lifelong complications and requirements of hormone replacement therapy before they can even speak. And yeah, don't worry, we'll get to that later, because some of you right now might be saying, well, these are necessary procedures. And I have to tell you that no, they aren't. There are very specific times surgery is necessary, perhaps to remove a urinary blockage or treat a cancer, though there is a big difference between having the cancer and only being at risk of it. But these aren't common, certainly not common enough to warrant a generalized approach anyway. Do you want to know the #1 reason that we do it? F***ing social stigma. We want boys standing up to pee and girls to have tiny clits, not because it's right or natural, but because it's normal. I'll step in real quick here because I don't really want to go too far into this issue. I have some very strong feelings about it and would rather not risk mouthing off as I try to keep it concise. The nuance of how we deal with it is vast and would need its own video, to be honest. What I will say, however, is do not just blame parents for it, okay? The medical establishment is scary and complex and frankly should shoulder the lion's share of the blame for reinforcing this idea of wanting normal children ahead of preserving their bodily autonomy. I only bring it up to highlight the absurdity. This practice of dealing with intersex people leans heavily on appeals to ideas of natural and healthy to justify chopping up children, but it's not natural to literally change what nature dished out, and there is zero evidence to suggest it's healthier. So what are we doing? We're clinging to an incomplete understanding of biology and using it not to describe the reality we see, but to prescribe, assign, one we already concluded was correct, despite the harm that causes. And when people like Kathleen demonstrate the common cultural tradition of subsuming biological variation within the binary classificatory system of sex, the system of understanding behind these mistakes gets further entrenched, despite the scientific community having known biology isn't as cut and dry as a binary for years. And unfortunately, we lap it up because culturally we're still obsessed with this idea that we must be girls or boys, often not even waiting until birth to find out which. You have to be one. And when it's unclear, we're unsatisfied.
I hope you don't think I'm dense or something, but is Pat a man or a woman?
And well, See above for where that leads. Of course, all transphobes are guilty of upholding the prescriptive system of sex. Without it, their binary bioessentialist attempts to deny trans people our identities just absolutely fall apart. But what makes Kathleen's contribution so egregious is the fact she's doing it under the label of feminism, seemingly completely ignorant of how this very system infamously gets weaponized to justify the withholding of equal rights for women, too. How you can call yourself a feminist and not see that astounds me. The whole women are biologically X and therefore unsuitable for Y trope is as old as dirt, grounded in the prescriptive system and not something you'd miss if you actually cared about women's rights. And look, I know what TERFs and their supporters usually say in response to this, but I'm sorry we haven't got time today to go through the whole sex-based rights thing gender criticals base their feminism on. I will leave resources down there though, explaining things like discrimination by perception, street misogyny, and negative rights that show why this argument is complete bullshit. The Catherine McKinnon paper is particularly tasty. Now, if all transphobes uphold and don't challenge the harmful prescriptive system of sex, and if all TERFs do it in spite of their alleged feminism, why single out Kathleen, you may ask? Well, if you remember, which I wouldn't blame you for if you didn't, don't check the video time, the point of this section was to show that sex is a social construct and not natural, calling into question the validity of transphobic biology arguments when they fall back on what men and women should be. It's probably sounded like leftist quack nonsense so far, so it would be useful if one of these transphobes citing sex as natural gave the game away and wound up agreeing with me, wouldn't it? In her book, the chapter on sex is a Groundhog Day of here's nuanced binary sex can't account for, but let's just plod along anyway. After seemingly, to any onlooker paying attention, proving gamete and chromosomal accounts of sex inadequate, Kathleen turns to, hold on to your hats, Richard Boyd, a philosopher, to justify her work.
The philosopher Richard Boyd proposed a homeostatic property cluster account of biological species. According to HPC, species are defined in terms of relatively stable clusters of morphological characteristics, plus underlying mechanisms producing those characteristics. Crucially, according to HPC, no particular characteristic in the cluster nor underpinning mechanism is counted as essential for any individual's membership of the species. As long as the individual possesses enough of the important properties in the cluster, it still counts as a member of the species in question. Perhaps we can adapt the HPC account to explain the basis of two naturally occurring categories, male and female.
Science and philosophy aren't necessarily antonyms, but the divestment from raw biology is clear here, right? Words like important and enough are arbitrary in meaning. You know, it's us who decide what's important, what constitutes enough. If this is how Kathleen defines the system essential to her feminism and transphobia, there can be no doubt that sex is socially constructed, right? By her own metric, the status of man and woman depends on a quantity of important traits we, as a society, decided was enough. Now, to be fair, Kathleen does seem to acknowledge this, later putting the words enough and important in little quotation marks. But to be balanced, she then just plods along and upholds sex as a natural binary regardless. But that's not where this ends. Oh no. In true Kathleen style, she goes on to say the quiet part out loud, the thing that blows all the transphobic biology arguments out of the water, an admission that upholding and propagating the system of sex was never about biology all along.
What counts as enough of the important features in a cluster, as with the HPC account, is in a sense a practical decision to be made in relation to wider theoretical goals. And as mooted in relation to HPC, perhaps these goals need not be exclusively medical or biological, and so might conceivably place heavier emphasis on the outer observable features of a person in the everyday than on chromosomes or inner reproductive organs.
This quote, let me tell you, enrages me. I could probably spend an entire video unpacking it. Like, after hearing these people denigrate us on the grounds of our sex, having our chromosomes and gametes leveraged against us every fucking time they open their mouths to argue against our equal rights, to then hear one say, well, those things aren't everything, just really feels like, gee, it's almost as if that's what we've all been saying this entire fucking time. But in my last desperate attempt to keep to the point, let's focus on how this passage further identifies the classificatory system of sex as social in origin. This is someone infamous for leveraging sex as a natural destiny one can't meaningfully flee, not only identifying the system's means as a philosophical consensus, but openly stating the goal of such a consensus is rooted in social desires as well as the stated biological ones transphobes hinge everything on to deny us our rights, which, hilariously, is correct. Systems like sex have always been utilised by power structures for the purpose of social control, using the veneer of nature to justify it, dividing us into two distinct categories based on superficial and not substantive traits, and really pressurising the importance of those categories by treating us different, rewarding and punishing certain behaviours based on which we're in, and all the while claiming conformity is natural, serves to terminate dissent, keeping us divided and, crucially, in line. Reinforcing sexist norms keeps the workforce reproducing and believing that very work is our natural destiny, whilst training us to focus on what divides us instead of what unites us, to stop us from organising to reclaim the benefits of said work from the crocs, that's a joke from 2 years ago, holy shit, in power upholding those norms to maintain their privilege. Of course, any innate non-conformity would challenge the system's legitimacy, so it's imperative that intersex people's valid realities be disregarded as anomalies and erased. But as a feminist, Kathleen, plus all you other gender-critical sticks, you're supposed to understand and oppose that system, not uphold it for fuck's sake. Okay, at this point, I hope it's clear that sex is not as natural as most would have us believe. If someone like Kathleen, who benefits greatly from us believing it is, can't help but identify it as socially constructed in her own unprovoked words, what else is there to say? As I've mentioned, the point of this whole discussion of identifying sex as the socially constructed icing on the cake of biology isn't to drag it or to say, if you believe this, you're bad. It's to point out that it's within our means to rethink it and make room for the discoveries we've been ignoring over the years, whilst excising some of the harmful cultural presumptions about women being less suitable for work and men being called emotionless innovators. I know it's tough because, to be honest, the stories we're told about sex, about it being natural and binary, about what men and women are typically like, they feel right to a lot of people. Even medically, sex in of itself doesn't harm most of us. Au contraire, it helps us, as I've said. But it is incomplete, and it doesn't help everyone. And the longer we cling to it, the closer we hold our presumptions and uphold this prescriptive system, the more harm we subject those who don't conform to. It isn't easy, and there are a lot of good things sex does for us as a system. Like, I'm not suggesting we get rid of it entirely, but it has to change. In some cases it already has, like for example the restructuring of medical language to identify body parts associated with certain concepts instead of presuming they belong to a man or a woman. Because someone doesn't get PCOS due to being a woman, they get it because they have ovaries. Trans men and male-presenting intersex people with typically female genitalia can fit that definition too. But we need more. A lot more. We need to drop this arrogance we have about correcting intersex children. There's nothing to correct. Even the medically necessary surgeries should be focused on doing the bare minimum required to make the genitalia work instead of giving a shit about whether they conform or not. We also need to push back against this idea of social stigma being a valid reason to do that to a child, because all you're really doing in that situation is preserving the system ahead of their bodily autonomy. And we need to reject appeals to nature to resist this idea of sex being natural, because it's not. It is a socially imposed means of grouping people into two categories based on vague interpretations of collections of biological differences. Categories that can't incorporate everyone and oftentimes seem more about pathologizing people to then chastise them when they don't fit that pathology. Remember when Julia Serano mentioned legal sex? Why do we even need that if it's not about social control? So perhaps the biggest thing we need to do with sex is fight attempts to cite it in social contexts. The prescriptive system is behind things like beauty standards, toxic masculinity, sex-based discrimination, and, as we've been dancing around for a while, transphobia. The attempts to tie us to our biology and deny us our genders, plus the equal rights associated with them, always come from appeals to the prescriptive model. Remember the beginning of this section? Matt Walsh was calling intersex people anomalies and saying
something has gone wrong.
He's appealing here to the prescriptive system of sex. He thinks intersex people are anomalies because the system can't account for them, and that women are of the nature to get pregnant because that's what the system says. He's hierarchizing biological realities that don't conform as not as good, despite what those people may feel about their own bodies, and leveraging that to do the same to those who purposefully shun conformity. But it doesn't have to be that way. Our understanding of biology doesn't have to be this rigid, binary view. We already know from earlier how malleable it is, how one characteristic can't tell the whole story, so why shouldn't our system of understanding reflect that? Why shouldn't we welcome variation with open arms instead of sidelining it as disease or an anomaly? I deliberately chose a strange and low-stakes example at the start of the video to get the ball rolling, but like the steering wheel, we understand our biology in a certain way because of the man-made circumstances surrounding it. Sex. So it's within our grasp to change that. We created this system to help us understand the world, a noble goal at first. But the world isn't what we thought it was, and it's being harmed because of our unwillingness to recognise that. So it's time we did right by everyone we've wronged. It's time we changed. So, where does this all leave us with regards to transphobes and their biology arguments? Well, I hope that by now you're realising they're full of shit. Because, genuinely, what are the central pillars of this belief system? That biology is a simple binary where we're either men or women, that this is just how nature works, and that any attempt to subvert it is futile because your biology will always be the same, and of course that this categorization is unequivocally worth putting stock in as a way of structuring society. Firstly, we know now that biology is not a simple binary, so attempting to diagnose people as only their birth sex with a mere two possible options falls flat on its face the moment we introduce intersex realities, okay? We also know that the decision to split biology into two discrete categories in the first place was a decision of philosophical consensus, and that biology cares not for conforming to those categories in every situation, so no, the system of two sexes is not natural. We know that trans people are very capable of subverting our biological realities in myriad ways. You know, we can change our hormones, our secondary characteristics, our genitals, and we're not a million miles away from changing our reproductive roles either, although I'd argue we already do that when we become infertile through hormones and surgery. So by the metrics of actual biologists, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily call myself female yet, but I'd sure as shit say a hell of a lot of other trans women fit that description, and likewise with trans men being male. And as for putting stock in the system of classification, well, allow me to cite the historical disempowerment of women, the medical mishandling of intersex people, the toxic dirge of hypermasculinity. I could go on, but I won't, because it's more prudent to ask, what positives does sex, the system, give us? We have to deal with so fucking many societal ills justifying themselves at its feet, but what's the point? I mean, we know what, it's social control, but none of us see the benefits of that. That's for the crocs, and fuck them. I know that right-wing grifters obviously make a lot of money peddling the system of sex as a means to shit on trans people for the viewers, but if I may speak to those viewers, those that are still here, what do you get out of it? Like, is it really that important for you to be matched up to this arbitrary label? And is your connection to it so insecure that you need to essentialize your membership down to a single trait? Because Take it from someone who's thought way too much about her membership. Stop it! It ain't worth it! So basically, all facets of the anti-trans biology arguments public transphobes present are very easily torn apart. You know, if you consider a thoroughly researched hour-long video essay easy. But can I tell you a secret? Come here. None of them care. I'm not the first person to point this out. Despite citing it constantly to denigrate us, transphobes really do not actually give a shit about biology. I mean, if they did, they'd have bothered to do the readings and realised these attempts to justify denying us our identities hold no merit. As has been said many times before, this isn't some misguided attempt at finding truth, it's about shutting down trans people. Biology in this case is just another arrow in the anti-trans quiver the history books will show as breaking upon us. Like, just look at how much the goalposts have shifted over the years. Back in the 90s and 2000s, the transphobic yardstick was genitals, and when that proved politically inefficient thanks to gender reassignment surgery, the focus shifted to chromosomes in the 2010s, and now in the 2020s, since testing chromosomes is difficult and time-consuming and potentially counterproductive, they're onto gametes. They don't care! All they're doing is picking a biological trait they think they can grift and shifting to the next one the moment it wears thin. And honestly, looking at the potential mechanics of womb transplants, as well as how we subvert gamete production with surgery and hormones, there will come a time when they drop that one too. And we already know where they're headed next. As Lily Alexander demonstrates in her video on TERFs and biology, the next transphobic yardstick will be birth sex.
How can TERFs claim this special connection to material reality while denying the realities of trans people's bodies? Well, I'll let you in on a little secret. Transphobes' definition of biological sex has nothing to do with biology. In fact, it has nothing to do with anything observable at all. They don't really believe that sex is your chromosomes or your gametes. They don't believe that sex is your legal marker or your hormones or your body type. What they believe, the only thing they believe, is that sex is how you're born and it can never change. It's that simple.
We've absolutely seen this too, all over the video. I categorised the first quote from Kathleen's book,
given circumstances,
as an appeal to the system of prescriptive sex. And sure, it is, but through this lens, it's also a subtle nod to a transphobic preference of birth sex ahead of our current biological realities, which, as I hope is clear after everything we've talked about today, has nothing to do with how biology actually works. It's an appeal to sex assigned at birth, and we know those categories only exist because of an arbitrary philosophical consensus. Transphobes do not care about biology. They've spent decades being wrong about it, ignoring the evidence and clinging to outdated understandings to justify themselves. And as trans healthcare improves, there will come a time they have to leave it behind. Their only goal is to shit on trans people and to convince others, especially lawmakers, to do the same. Biology was only ever the weapon, a bad one, and if you can't see that now, I don't think you ever will. Which means we're done. Enjoy being on the wrong side of history. I've called this section How Transphobia is Hurting Us All, because it's my hope that you can see, after learning how wrong people like Matt Walsh and Kathleen Stock are about biology, that they're just proponents of a hate movement who will grasp at any straw they can so long as it furthers their one true goal of destroying the lives of trans people. And that maybe, if you can see that you'd be willing to look a little further into the other shit they say about us and how it hurts not just trans people, but everyone. Let's start with the bit I promised. If you're here, you're probably familiar with the groomer lie, that trans people are enforcing surgeries and hormones on children because we're trying to recruit them or whatever. Now, this isn't true. There's no evidence corroborating it, but after learning about the state of intersex healthcare, pardon me, but I just don't think transphobes actually care about enforced surgeries and hormone replacement therapy, since none of them ever mention this thing they're outraged about when it's actually happening. What they're doing here, other than demonstrably lying about trans people to smear us for the 19,000th fucking time, look at the fucking guidelines, is stopping you from learning about the genuine examples of children's bodily autonomy being violated. Their thought-terminating lie dissuades you from pursuing the issue further, since, after all, they did the thinking for you. And even if you manage to learn the truth, you might end up blaming trans people for it instead of who's actually responsible: scared parents and the biases of an indifferent medical establishment. They're indirectly pushing intersex people further into the shadows, where, without wider recognition and pushback, they'll continue to be at risk of mistreatment. This cloaking of systemic problems extends to the prisons issue too. Gender criticals like Kathleen Stock tend to hyper-focus on the issue of trans women being admitted to women's prisons, where these males will essay female prisoners. Now, the trans prisoner population is tiny, reported to be 0.2% of all prisoners in 2021, in the UK at least. Yet the scope of prison essay is huge, especially for women. Prisoners are likely to be essayed by their peers, by guards, both overwhelmingly cis, and their chances of legal recourse are slim to fucking none. So focusing on trans women in women's prisons is a ridiculous position to take if you actually cared about improving our prison system. Like, I won't deny that trans prisoners do sometimes commit SA, but why focus on their transness here and not on the fact our prison system put a sex offender in close contact with their likeliest victims? And that's not even getting into the fact that trans people are magnitudes more likely to be victims of prison SA. But sure, Kathleen and co, focus on this one issue. Definitely seems like you care about women in prisons. Like, let me tell you a story from Shon Faye's The Transgender issue, one that proves that transphobes do not actually care about women in prisons and just wish to use them as a weapon against trans women. Karen White is an infamous figure in transphobic circles, as she's an example that proves trans women are predators. She's been convicted of gross indecency to children and assault in the past. She stabbed an old man in his home and repeatedly committed SA whilst in prison. She's a piece of shit, basically. And her infamy is well deserved, but what's very telling about her eventual conviction of prison SA in 2018 is how silent everyone was when, just a few months later, Ian Cox, a guard at that same prison, was convicted for essaying a prisoner. Like, it seems that the transphobic fury at males in women's prisons begins and ends with trans women. If they cared about safety in women's prisons so much, where was the outrage, the critique? Once again, more than just trans people have their plight hurt by transphobia.
While the Karen White case was used as the basis for many comment pieces in the media on keeping men, trans women, out of women's prisons and in campaign messaging against gender recognition laws, it's notable that the Cox case did not translate into the same feminist arguments against the presence of male guards in female prisons.
And last bit for today, I felt it poignant to respond to another whopper from Matt Walsh and how his ignorant, thought-terminating leveraging of prescriptive sex promotes just the worst kind of self-satisfied incuriosity.
You're responding to a health emergency. Biological male, somebody with a penis, is having a medical emergency. And they say to you, I think I'm having a miscarriage. Would you check them to see if they're having a miscarriage? Would you consider that a possibility for them?
No, but that's because some people don't have body parts. Doesn't mean they're not a woman.
Okay. Sounds like we've established there are some people who, in principle, can get pregnant, and there are some people who can't. So there's two categories, otherwise known as binary.
So this obviously isn't a serious point. He's completely ignorant of the fact those categories need social input to take form. Like, there are tons of ways we could categorize people. For example, that Philosophy Tube video I mentioned earlier discusses using height as a way of creating a binary, but also capacity for pregnancy isn't what sex is either. Yes, he does go on to turn this point into one about sex, but that's him shifting the goalposts from capacity for pregnancy to people he thinks should have that, in terms he might understand.
But that's a different conversation.
The example's just ridiculous. It'd never happen, and Walsh presenting it just subsumes all nuance in the realms of sex, gender, and healthcare. Like, for starters, I thought I'd Google men claiming to have miscarriages, and while I didn't find any examples, I did find some studies suggesting men might cause miscarriages. Seems useful to know. Also, trans men and intersex men with female internal genitalia could be having miscarriages, so I hope the doctor they go see doesn't have the same dismissive, presumptuous attitude Matt's displaying here. And I think citing medical situations in his upholding of prescriptive sex warrants a discussion on the implicit sex and/or gender bias demonstrably prevalent in healthcare since time immemorial. There are several examples of women being misdiagnosed and waiting longer for treatments than men due to sex-based presumptions, malpractice that frequently compounds with race, weight, and transness, all because of that same oversimplified framework Matt is parroting and further entrenching here. He really thinks this example is a gotcha, but okay. I wonder how he'd feel about my more likely hypothetical scenario with tangible real-world application. An intersex woman goes to the doctor complaining of an overactive bladder or groin pain, and if the doctor operates under the same system of presumptuous prescriptive sex as Matt, he may just assume that it's a urine infection and leave it at that, even though, in this scenario, because biology and binary sex do not gel, she has prostate cancer.
There's two categories.
So what am I getting at here? Well, the goal is to highlight how dishonest transphobes have to be to indulge the worldview they're peddling. Basically nothing they ever say holds any merit. It's just an appeal to the worst impulses of rejecting difference we all get conditioned into us by the general lessons and narratives we grow up with. But there's more to it than just bigotry. These arguments they make encourage a close-minded, simplistic worldview that discourages you from thinking for yourself, from learning some really interesting things you might miss when you click off a Matt Walsh or Kelly J. Keane video content with the feeling that your thinking has been done for you. And some of those interesting things are actually really important for us to know. As I've already pointed out, transphobia is a huge proponent of the systems harming intersex people, and the insistence that we're inherently predatory blinds you to the actual examples of institutional predation being done in prisons, medical establishments, and other places. The time you spend falsely believing that trans people are coming to get you is time you're not spending learning about and opposing actual injustices in the world. It's really not surprising the people pushing this narrative into public consciousness are media executives, privileged pundits, and politicians, because transphobia, as with all systemic bigotries, is a distraction tactic to keep people divided, incurious, and, above all, in the dark about the injustices necessary for these privileged few to maintain the status quo. If you're spending your time hating trans people, or hell, any disenfranchised minority, you're not spending your time uniting with people to fight for a better society. So, transphobia really is hurting all of us. It directly harms trans people, its reliance on upholding the antiquated social construct of sex indirectly harms intersex people, women and men, and the fiercely anti-intellectual stance required to propagate it harms us all. We need to reject people like Matt Walsh, Ben Shapiro, Kelly J. Keane, J.K. Rowling, Julie Bindel, Kathleen Stock, Piers Morgan, Suella Braverman, Michael Knowles, etc., 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 because allowing them to dictate our thoughts is only serving them and not us. It's sad seeing people fall down this rabbit hole because it's not only mushing their brains, it's isolating them too. I mean, look at what happened to Graham Linehan. His entire family cut ties with him because they just couldn't handle the war he decided to wage on a marginalised community. Like, think of all the meaningful relationships you could form, all the interesting people you could meet from communities that could enrich your life in so many ways. If you'd only shun the ideas destroying you and open your mind to the world. That got poetic, didn't it? Thank you so much for watching till the end. This was an intense one, so I really appreciate you being here. Please do remember to click like if you enjoyed, leave a comment if you think I got something wrong, or if I missed a bit, or, if there are bits you liked. Patreon.com/themetalgoddess is where you can support me making more of these, and please do remember to subscribe for more. Okay, bye everyone! I love you all! Eee!
So, are we done here? Am I going to get paid?